Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to look at Chapter 19, Part 1, with this history bite on the continued political evolution within Europe. By the end of this history bite, you should be able to answer two essential questions. How did the political systems of Europe continue to evolve during this time? And how did the political situations of the larger empires compare to that of the regional states? Let us first start with the larger empires. Since the time of Charlemagne, the power of the Holy Roman Empire had declined, specifically that of the emperors, while the lords and princes, their power had proportionally increased. Now, of course, this allowed for an expansion of the empire itself in terms of territory, as more princes and lords could join the empire. Unfortunately, this also meant that the emperor himself did not have control of all this new territory. The Holy Roman Emperor may have dominated Central Europe, but the emperor himself did not have a lot of that power. In addition to this, the papacy, aka the Pope, aka the Bishop of Rome, aka the head of the church in the West, constantly interfered with the policies of the emperor. For example, Pope Gregory interfered with Emperor Henry over who was allowed to choose high church officials. This resulted in something called the Investiture controversy, in which the emperor had to acknowledge that, in fact, the Pope was the one allowed to appoint church officials, which was conceding authority from the emperor to the Pope. Another emperor, named Barbarossa, attempted to annex parts of northern Italy to finance a more centralized control of his empire. However, the Pope did not like the idea of a strong, unified Holy Roman Empire, and so sought to defeat Barbarossa with a political alliance that, in the end, did successfully defeat the emperor on the field of battle. The famous philosopher Voltaire famously said that the empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. And if we think about the strict definition of empire that we've seen, which is a centralized authority with power coming from the top, then yes, the Holy Roman Empire does not fit the bill for a traditional empire. Doesn't mean it wasn't a unique state all its own, but it was not an empire in the traditional sense. Let's talk about a regional monarchy, a monarchy so called because it is concentrated in one region. Now, France, as we know it, began to take shape around 900 CE, with their leader named Hugh Capet given the title King of the Franks, and this would later become King of the French about 200 years later. Franks is a term that is synonymous with French. Now, initially, Hugh and his descendants only ruled Paris. However, if you've also wondered why it is that Paris is the capital of France, this is part of the reason why. However, Hugh and his descendants gradually expanded their territory over the next 400 years, taking lands from lords who died childless and taking lands from heretical lords. See the Cathar Crusade, the Albigensian Crusade. Over time, the kings slowly began to assert their own authority over the lords. So, for example, King Louis IX established the Parlement, or what he called the King's Justice. And what this implied was that the king actually was the one who had the power to provide justice and dole out justice, not necessarily the local lord. And the king could overrule the local lord in terms of applying justice for all under the king. And so this is a very gradual effort to assert the authority of the central monarch. England was also beginning to take shape during this time. So before the year 1000, England, as we know it today, was a collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, named for the people who had migrated there after the fall of the Roman Empire, known as Angles, Saxons, and another group called the Jutes. In 1066, a guy named William of Normandy, who was distantly related to the last English king, or the last Saxon king that claimed authority over all of England, invaded and conquered England, and took all of the land from the conquered Saxon lords and redistributed it to his Norman lords who came with. And he created a centralized state underneath him and created an accounting of the empire, something called the Doomsday Book, in which he took into account all the property across the empire: sheep, cows, houses, gold, you name it, it was in the book. This effort at centralization would continue in England, and by the 1400s, England may have been the most centralized state in all of Europe. Now, their descendants of William of Normandy would continue to wage wars across the continent, mostly in France. This would later lead to something called the 100 Years' War, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Now, another interesting group of political bodies was something called the city-states. Now, these were found in northern Italy, and they were a number of states that by the year 1100 had grown to be independent of themselves. They were large enough to have their own military, sometimes their own navies, and their power was based on the wealth that they were able to derive from trading finished manufactured goods, such as beautiful textiles, guns, glass, iron, right? These cities were growing in population as the population of Europe itself began to revive, which we'll talk more about in the next part. Now, what's interesting about these is that they were small and easy to govern, so they were heavily centralized. And some of them weren't even monarchies. Some of them, like Venice, were actually republics, which meant that the rulers were actually answerable to the people. And when I mean the people, I mean those who had any actual influence. Officially, there was, like in Venice, there was an assembly where everybody could go vote, but unofficially, as usual, those with money and power could influence the selection of the members of that particular Senate. But it's interesting that each of these city-states built their power and reputation on trade as well as their small size. Now, there were some very interesting zones of interaction across Europe at this time. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, a state began to crop up called the Kievan Rus. This is where we get the word Russia. This is kind of when we first hear that word Russia. Now, this was a state originally founded by a group of Viking explorers who wanted to create kind of their own state. But over time, it acknowledged its Slavic roots and became the largest Slavic state in Europe. And also, thanks to the work of Byzantine missionaries, it agreed to adopt Christianity. And following the fall of Constantinople, this territory of the Kievan Rus would become the largest state in Europe that followed Eastern Christianity. Now, the Normans, the same group of people from the same area as William of Normandy, didn't just go to England. They actually also traveled all around Europe and built a number of small kingdoms in the Mediterranean, such as in Malta, which is this tiny island between North Africa and Italy. Also North Africa itself and parts of southern Italy. But the most well-known and probably most influential Norman kingdom was that of Sicily, which was ruled over for about 200 years by the descendants of King Roger, the first king of Sicily. And what's interesting was Sicily had been ruled by the Greeks, the Byzantines, then conquered by Muslims, and then conquered by the Normans. And so within Norman Sicily, you had a very interesting mixture of cultures. And I've studied this a little bit more detail. So for example, King Roger II, his tomb is in Greek, Norman, and Arabic. And one of the great kings of Normandy was presented with a map that was named after him, the Map of Roger, or the Tabula Rogeriana, which was drawn using Ptolemy's geography with updated Islamic knowledge. Ptolemy's geography being one of the most prominent maps of the world at the time. But Islamic scholars had improved upon it using knowledge from other parts of the Islamic world. And so this map that combined all of that was presented to one of the Norman kings. And so Norman Sicily, for being a small centralized kingdom, was also a fascinating zone of cultural interactions. So you should be able to answer those essential questions from the first slide. I want to thank you for enjoying this bite of history with me, and I hope to see you next time.